Hi, this is Professor Lisa Runquist talking to you about Unit 1 of the course on religious organizations. And we're going to start by focusing on constitutional rights of religious organizations, but along with that, well, what is a church, what is a religion, and who are we really talking about, and how does the government laws impact this area? The First Amendment, well, first of all, there are two areas of government oversight that are important to recognize. You've got both the state and the federal law. The state courts are generally considered courts of general jurisdiction, which means they can pretty much handle anything. Federal courts are courts of limited jurisdiction, and that's because under the Constitution, the United States Constitution, federal courts and the federal government can only deal with specific areas that are set forth for them to deal with regard to the laws that impact the citizens of the United States. And if it isn't specifically provided for in the Constitution, then the federal government has no right to get involved. Now, when the Constitution was proposed, of course, there was the Bill of Rights that was presented. A number of states said they would not sign onto the Constitution without the Bill of Rights. Now, the First Amendment to the Constitution, which is in the Bill of Rights, has several provisions that will be important as we go along. The Establishment Clause is quite interesting because it says that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a church. Well, how does that impact the states? With regard to the states, the 14th, in fact, at the time the Congress or at the time the Constitution was adopted, there were several states that had state churches. And so when it said Congress shall not establish it, it meant Congress, it meant the federal government. But the 14th Amendment has been interpreted to apply these constitutional protections to the state as well. So today, no government entity, whether it's state or federal, has the right to establish a church. In addition, there's a free exercise clause. The Congress and thus the states do not have a right to prohibit the free exercise of religion. And that is definitely a protection that our forefathers thought was important, and clearly today is perhaps even more important than it might have been at that time. In addition, if you go through and read the rest of the First Amendment, you'll find there's the freedom of speech and a freedom of assembly. Those are both also very important when it comes to churches and religious organizations. In fact, oftentimes the cases will be decided on that basis rather than either the establishment or the free exercise clause. Now, once you get past that and you say, okay, so we know that there are these protections, who are we protecting? And then you get into a whole question of, well, what is religion and what is a church? There's an issue with regard to religion that has been expanded on with a number of cases, and in fact, there have been some cases that have found that any system of belief, even if it's an atheistic system, is generally going to be found to be a religion if indeed you have an entire an entire viewpoint that you've set forth and you govern your life under that. It will be a religion, and in fact that has been, again, as I said, there have been cases that have found that to be the case. And in fact, one of the the situations that we'll talk about with regard to whether parsonage allowance is allowable. Many of the cases that are being brought by a group, Freedom from Religion, and they again consider what they believe to be as much a religion as a church. So that's something to keep in mind as we go through, that religion does not mean the Christian religion. It doesn't mean the Jewish religion. It means any type of viewpoint that you would approach your life in governing it. Now, when we refer to church, that is going to include anything that looks like a church, and it's not a Christian church, or not limited to a Christian church. It includes mosques, it includes synagogues, it includes temples. So whether it's the Jewish religion, the Buddhist religion, the Muslim religion, the Christian religion, everyone is protected on the same level, because you can't discriminate on the basis of religion. The Internal Revenue Service has actually adopted 14 points that they look at in determining whether someone is a church, and that's something you should go through and look at all of these 14 points. And in fact, one of the assignments will be dealing with looking at them, and one question, of course, is which of these do you think are the most important? Do you think there are any that you don't need in order to have a church, or are there some that you think are extremely important if you're going to have a church? And that's something we'll talk about. Now, when we talk again about churches, you'll find that when we get into tax exemption issues, there are some organizations that are similar to churches that are going to be treated the same way. Some of them are connected. For example, a convention or association of churches will be considered a church for purposes of applying the same law. If you have an integrated agency or an integrated auxiliary of the church, that will be considered to be have the same protection as a church in most instances, although the integrated auxiliary may not have quite as much protection, and we'll talk about that as well. Religious orders are going to be considered to be treated in the same way as churches for the most part, and again, there are always exceptions. And then when you get into other entities, you need to really look at them and say, well, is this a part of the church? Is it not a part of the church? And for example, religious schools, if it's a school is conducted by a church, it will be considered to be part of the church and protected the same way as a church. If it's separately incorporated, then it's not going to have the same level of protection as a church does. So that's something to look at as you go through. And this whole course will be dealing with all of these different types of questions, but that's where we need to start, is with what are the rights, what are the constitutional rights, what is the basis for establishing the law in the United States impacting churches. And I would just mention also that this is different from the law in other countries. For example, Canada does not have a First Amendment to the Constitution, so there's not the same protection for churches in Canada as there is in the United States. And in fact, the First Amendment is something that's very specific to the United States, and we can thank our forefathers for having the foresight to consider this something that is worthy of constitutional protection.